In the CAPTURE trial, we studied a novel percutaneous carotid coil filter. This coil filter is made out of a single nitinol fiber. It's injected through a 25 gauge needle directly into the carotid artery. So we use an ultrasound, surface ultrasound, to look at the carotid artery, puncture with the needle directly into the carotid artery, and then there's a motorized unit that expels the coil so that it unfurls into the carotid artery. Once it's in good position, then it's deployed. And we do this bilaterally, so in both carotids. Now, most stroke prevention devices are actually directed to the left atrial appendage, which is the source of emboli in the majority of patients with atrial fibrillation. This particular device is a little bit different. Its implantation is, in some sense, simpler because there is no percutaneous access other than the direct puncture. And you would imagine that someday this could become even an outpatient procedure if it proves to be safe and effective. The CAPTURE trial was a first-in-human feasibility trial to assess the safety and feasibility of this carotid coil filter in preventing stroke. So the trial was designed to address those patients who are at greatest need, the patients who should be on oral anticoagulation, but because of bleeding risks can't take the oral anticoagulants. So that's the population that we addressed. And because it was a safety and feasibility trial, it was a non-randomized study. We did conduct it at 4 different centers, and a total of 25 patients were enrolled. With regards to what we found in this particular trial, the primary feasibility endpoint, was the ability to place 2 carotid filters in a given patient in both carotids. And of the 25 patients that were enrolled, we were successfully able to implant the filters bilaterally in 23 of those patients. So that's a 92% success rate. Now, one of the patients where it was failed actually had the filter placed successfully in one carotid, but then we decided not to put it in the other carotid because of significant atherosclerotic disease. The other patient had poor visibility by ultrasound because of a thick neck, and therefore we were unsuccessful in both carotids. The second important endpoint was a safety endpoint, and there were no acute safety events of significance. There were some mild hematomas, but nothing of significance. We also had secondary safety endpoints following these patients out with the serial ultrasound imaging to assess whether or not the coil was intact or whether there were any complications, and it turned out there were no problems with the coil. There was no fracture, there was no migration, and there was patency through all the coils. And we followed these patients out to a year. The final point is that we had a hint of efficacy of the coils, meaning in 4 patients, there were a total of 6 thrombi that were actually captured by the coil. And these patients received additional subcutaneous heparin that dissolved the coil over dissolved not the coil, but dissolved the thrombus over the subsequent time period. I should note that the thrombus, those 4 patients that had thrombus, there were no clinical events, meaning the patients didn't suffer any neurological sequelae. They were identified on the routine screening ultrasound exams. So the next steps are to try to expand this to a slightly different population. So there's a European second feasibility trial that we're just about to commence, where patients who have atrial fibrillation, high risk for stroke, despite taking oral anticoagulation, are going to be studied. Because ultimately the goal is to do a large randomized trial in patients who can take oral anticoagulations, are taking it, and randomizing them to continue to oral anticoagulation or continue to oral anticoagulation plus the filter to decrease the stroke risk even further.